Good morning, everyone. So good to have you here in the house of the Lord. Let me ask you, if you would, please stand out of reverence for the Word of God, and let's read together our theme verse for the year. You are good, and you do good. Teach me your statutes. Psalm 119:68. Thank you so much. You may be seated. We're continuing in our series of sermons where we're trying to take an overview of the whole Bible. I've titled the series, The Great Rescue, the Bible and Being Found by God. And it is a rescue story. We're in the period or the section of the Bible that covers the history of the period of the judges and the kings. Before we talk about, we're going to talk about a king today. Let me talk a little bit about the company Kodak. Y'all are familiar with that company, right? Some of you are old enough to know there was a time when Kodak dominated the whole market in terms of printing out photographs. They were just number one by far. But did you know that in 1975 they had a guy at their company that developed a digital camera? 1975. You know, Kodak is not known for its digital cameras. Clearly, they felt like the dominion they had in the whole market of printed photographs was something they did not want to jeopardize, going off on some weird venture of something that nobody probably wanted anyway. And eventually, in 2012, Kodak had to file for bankruptcy. They let their fears keep them out of something that would have secured them moving forward. And that's kind of the story we're going to look at today. We're looking at a king of Israel who let his fear rob him of the stability and security he could have known. We're looking at Jeroboam, and I've titled the message, A Wasted Opportunity. We're going to be in 1 Kings, the final part of chapter 11, and we'll skip ahead to the second half of chapter 12. So let's go ahead and start reading. And Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zeredah, his mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, a servant of Solomon, also raised a hand against the king. And this was the matter over which he raised a hand against the king. Solomon had built the Milo, closing the breach in the city of his father David. And the man Jeroboam was outstanding, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he installed him as the supervisor over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. Now let me connect the dots between what we were looking at last week and today. David lived this long life that seemed to go from crisis to crisis. When he came to the throne, the king that was there at the time before he came to the throne tried to kill him and chased him for years and used the whole army of Israel to chase after him. And he barely escaped with his life through that whole period. But eventually, the king that was king at the time died in battle, and David ended up being king. And even then, he had to fight enemies on all sides. They had the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the Syrians or Arameans, and the Tyrians or Sidonians. I mean, all around them were enemies, and David had to fight battle after battle to secure Israel in the land of Canaan from to really put an end to the harassment that had been the norm during the period of the judges. During the period of the judges, any nation around Israel that wanted to would just come in and plunder and take whatever they wanted and leave. And David had to put a stop to all that. So he spent his whole life as king fighting battles and establishing a peace for the people of Israel, which means that after David died and his son Solomon became king, he came into a kingdom that was enjoying an unprecedented time of stability, peace, and prosperity. Solomon walked into this and did not have to fight battles to establish peace because his father had already taken care of all that. So Solomon asked God for wisdom, and God gave it to him. So he was a very skilled administrator and was able to accomplish great things as king of Israel. And the way he secured the peace that his father had established was by creating alliances with other nations. And one of the ways he did this was by marrying princesses from other countries, to the point that he ended up having 700 wives. And in addition to this, I have no idea why he would need them, but 300 concubines on top of the 700 wives. One of the bad things that came from this is that his wives from other nations were not Israelite. They did not know about Yahweh. They did not worship Yahweh. They worshiped all the pagan gods of the neighboring nations. And late in his life, Solomon was drawn away from God by his wives, and they asked him to allow them to worship their gods, and he accommodated their worship of their gods and actually ended up joining them in worshiping these other gods. So later in his life, Solomon turned away from God. And that is often the situation, right? When we are in crisis, it tends to focus our attention, right? When we're in crisis and we know we don't have time to waste time on stupid stuff, we have to focus on what's going to keep us afloat. That's why many people show up in church when they are in crisis. That's the moment in life where they clearly recognize they need God to help them out. When things are going well, a lot of people assume, I don't really need God. I've got it. But when you're in crisis, and David lived his whole life that way, he stayed really close to God. And he depended on God through his life. But when you come into a situation where there are no crises and everything is fine and everything is well and there are no difficulties in your life, it is very, very easy to drift away from God and say, I don't really need God. I'll just pursue this or that or the other. But notice how the problem is described here. The person that's going, and we're told, that Jeroboam also raised a hand against the king. They mentioned that his mother was a widow, which might indicate he grew up fatherless. But he grows up in Israel. He's an Ephraimite in the tribe of Israel. He's like right in the heart of the land of Israel there. And he's growing up in the territory of Ephraim. And he's apparently really qualified. He's a hardworking, industrious, strong. He's the kind of guy you want leading things. And Solomon is involved in one of his construction projects. Now, Solomon did many construction projects. He built finally the temple that his father had envisioned for Yahweh. And he spared no cost. He used the best materials, the most skilled craftsmen, and he built the most glorious temple Canaan had ever seen. And he erected this glorious temple. I mean, so much of it was just covered in gold, and it was just spectacular, monumental, glorious. But that's not the only thing he built. He also built up the city of Jerusalem, and he raised up portions of the Temple Mount area, or the highest area of the city. And this Milo that we read about here, that he had built the Milo, this was kind of a stepped retaining wall structure that he was building so that he could raise up and level the ground on that part of the highest part of the city. And on that raised up area that the Milo made possible, he established his great palace complex. And built all of the buildings that were part of his palace complex, his home, the court where he would receive people, and all these other things. He built this monumental architecture, and there were open areas in the city that he used this retaining wall of the Milo to close up so that his city would be better defended. And he was laying the groundwork for not God's temple, but for his palace. And that's the matter that the author of Kings tells us. This is the matter over which Jeroboam's rising up against Solomon happened. And what I think he's pointing to here is that we're at a point in Solomon's life where he's finished God's temple, and now his attention has shifted to himself. Now that I've built God's temple, I want to build my own house. And boy, it's going to be great. I'm going to expand the Temple Mount. I'm going to build this Milo and retain as a big retaining wall. And I'm going to do this wonderful thing. And let me point out a detail that we read earlier in Kings in chapter 6. We begin at the end of chapter 6, and I'm going to go through the first verse of chapter 7. But in 6:37 we read, "In the 4th year the foundation of the house of Yahweh was laid in the month of Ziv. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts and according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building it." Now notice the very next verse. Solomon was building his own house 13 years. And he finished his entire house. So Solomon devoted 7 years of his attention to building God's house. But he devoted 13 years of his attention to building his own house. And we can see in this that Solomon's attention has shifted away from God to himself. And that's the matter, we're told. That's the matter over which Jeroboam becomes one of the 3 people that the author of this book is telling us raised their hand against Solomon. In the verses before the ones we're looking at today, it mentions 2 other persons from other nations who rose up against Solomon. But the third is an Israelite. It's Jeroboam himself. And it has to do with Solomon turning his attention away from God to himself. And this position that Jeroboam finds himself in, Solomon puts him in charge of the forced labor, because anytime you're doing monumental building in the ancient world, you use slaves. You need a lot of people who you're not going to pay much to do a lot of work. And that's the only way you built monumental things in antiquity. So he conscripted forced labor throughout all of Israel and relied most heavily on non-Israelites. But he also had to tap the resources and the time of Israelites to oversee everything and to lead the work and to do all these other things. So it was a tremendous drain on the whole nation, these grand monumental construction projects that Solomon was involved in. And Jeroboam is placed as a person has oversight of the forced labor of the house of Joseph. Now in the Bible you normally don't read about the house of Joseph because Israel shortly before he died called in Joseph and said, "Bring your 2 sons," and he laid his hands on them and blessed them, and he said, "You know what, these 2 are going to count as my sons, not yours." So he basically raised the 2 sons of Joseph up to the status of tribe of Israel. And that is why we almost never read of the tribe of Joseph. We read of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 sons of Joseph. So when we read that he's over the forced labor of the whole territory of Joseph, we're talking about the 2 largest tribes in Israel apart from Judah. And Manasseh was so big that it was divided into 2, and you had 1/2 of it in the area of Goshen on the other side of the Jordan, and the other half of it was right there in the heartland, the north heart of the territory of Israel. And these were the biggest tribes. So Jeroboam is set over the bulk of supervising the conscripted work in Israel. Verse 29, "And it came to pass at that time that Jeroboam left Jerusalem. And the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him along the way. And he had clothed himself in a new robe, and the 2 of them were alone in the open country." Now, before I keep reading, I want to explain a couple of things. First of all, Ahijah is from Shiloh. And if you think 2 generations back, let's skip back to not Solomon, who is here now, but David. And when David was young, Samuel, right? Shiloh was where the tabernacle of God was when Samuel's mother came to God and said, "God, if you will allow me to have a son, I will devote him to you all the days of his life." It was at Shiloh that she made that prayer. And God gave her the son Samuel, and she brought him as soon as he was weaned to the tabernacle there in Shiloh. And Shiloh is where Samuel, the last of the judges, grew up serving God in the tabernacle. And it's likely that Ahijah is a spiritual descendant of the ministry of Samuel. But he's a prophet, and he finds Jeroboam outside Jerusalem. He's somewhere on the way, who knows where, and finds him out in the open country. And we're told that they're alone, and that Ahijah has put on a brand new robe. Now for us, that's, oh, okay, good. You got some new digs. Great. We don't think much of that because we live in the post-industrial world, and we have had for a long time machines that can take fibers and weave them into cloth or turn them into thread. And we have machines that can use thread and pieces of fabric and easily sew together and fashion clothing so that we can have identical garments in the hundreds and the thousands. Now try to rewind your brain and think of a time before there were any of those machines. A time when the only clothing that existed anywhere on the face of the earth had to be hand-woven and hand-stitched together. There was only hand-woven, tailor-made clothing. There was no other kind of clothing. Now, how expensive is a hand-woven, tailor-made piece of clothing? I don't own anything like that. I don't know if you do. Now, I'm not just saying somebody who will sew it together for you. I'm saying somebody who will weave the cloth itself for you. How many man-hours are required to create a garment like that? That's why in antiquity, clothing was basically currency. We read in the Old Testament many stories where the way a king is rewarding somebody is he will give him 30 changes of clothes. And that is a fortune, because clothing was extremely valuable. In fact, at this time, most people only owned one set of clothing. You couldn't afford to have multiples. So here is Ahijah wearing a brand new robe. Hopefully now you understand what's going to happen next. And Ahijah grabbed hold of the new robe he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. So I want you to understand the horror that somebody in the ancient world would have had at that moment. What are you doing? I'll give you a contemporary example. Suppose you buy yourself a brand new Corvette and you drive it off the lot and park it in front of your house, and then proceed to take a baseball bat and just beat the crap out of it. What would you think of that? What are you doing? And oftentimes, prophets would do that. They would do something, kind of an object lesson that was really startling and would really grab your attention because they had something really important to communicate, and they wanted to make sure that this message would really imprint on your brain. And that's what Ahijah does. He takes this brand new cloth and just rips it into 12 pieces. So what's the point of this object lesson? Verse 31, and he told Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces. For thus says Yahweh, God of Israel, behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from Solomon's hand, and I will give you 10 tribes. But the one tribe will be his for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, god of Moab, and Milcom, god of the children of Ammon. And they have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes and in my statutes and judgments as his father David did. So here's the object lesson. I'm tearing this really valuable thing up. I'm giving you 10 pieces of this, and that's going to represent, here's what God's doing. There is something very valuable that God is going to tear up. And that very valuable thing is Israel. God is going to tear up the nation of Israel, and you are going to end up with 10 of the tribes of Israel. But I'm going to let the dynasty of David retain one tribe. And notice he doesn't say, I'm doing this because I love Solomon. He says, I'm doing this for the sake of David. We already saw last week, God made some promises to David. He entered into a covenant with David. I'm going to use your family and your dynasty to build the true house of God and to establish the eternal kingdom of God. Now, Solomon has accomplished building that temple and he's reigning, but clearly that's not the extent of God's promise to David. There's something much bigger yet to come. There's a different kind of house of God to be built, and there's a different kingdom to be established. But God is going to stay faithful to what he has promised David. And because of that, the lineage of David is going to remain. God's going to continue working. And God has determined that he is going to use the city of Jerusalem as the place in which he is going to fulfill the promises he made to David. So because of that, the descendants of David, the family of David, the house of David will retain control of Judah. But the reason for this split is that they have turned to other gods. Ashtoreth, that was the companion goddess to the Phoenician storm god Baal. They were kind of husband and wife, Baal and Ashtoreth. Then Moab has Chemosh. And notice, of all of these, the only ones that are described as the children of are the Ammonites. And I think there's a bit of an irony there, because the worship of their god Milcom also involved taking your sons and burning them alive to Milcom. These children of Ammon are killing their own children in worship of this god Milcom. We're told that Solomon, late in life, but at the behest of his wives, has established high places of worship in Jerusalem and devoted them to these gods, Chemosh of Moab and Milcom of the Ammonites. So both Solomon and all Israel following after him have turned away from God. But God is going to keep David's lineage going. Verse 34, nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom from his hand, because I have made him leader all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, who kept my commandments and my statutes. Notice, God is saying, I have unilaterally decided I'm going to let Solomon reign until his dying day. I am not going to I'm not going to allow him to lose the kingdom in his lifetime. And notice he says this is the reason, because of David. It's not because of Solomon. And I've observed this. Have you ever noticed that when you find a person who really, truly loves God and is devoted to God, sometimes you might notice that their children who do not love God are recipients of some grace and protection that is inexplicable. It has nothing to do with them pleasing God in any way. But sometimes, just because God loves the parent and wants to lessen the amount of grief that parent will have to endure in their life, he will pour some protection onto the kids just out of love of the parent. And it's because of God's love of David that Solomon will be able to rule until he dies. But, notice, Solomon's relationship with God is not going to help Rehoboam, his son. God is going to take the kingdom from his son. Solomon does not stand in the breach the way his father did. He has turned away from God, and as a result, there's no reason God has to stay his hand in bringing judgment on his son Rehoboam. And God says, I'm going to give you, Jeroboam, 10 of the tribes. And to his son I will give 1 tribe, so that it may be a lamp to my servant David forever before me in Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen for myself to put my name there. So this lineage is going to continue, even though the descendants of David almost immediately are already turning away from God. And Rehoboam will be worse than his father. He won't follow God at all. God says, I'm going to keep the house of David going, and I'm going to sustain this dynasty, even though the kings do not deserve to be protected or retained. And this has to do with what God has committed himself to do with David, so that it may be a lamp, so that the light of what I have promised David to do with his dynasty, that light will keep burning. And he talks again about what he's doing with David and what he's doing in Jerusalem. And this is how it will culminate. One day there will come a son of David, a descendant of David. And surprise of surprises, this kid will actually be God himself come in the flesh, miraculously born of the Virgin Mary into the house of David. And he will live a perfect, sinless life, and he will willingly come to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem give up his life to death and die on a cross and carry upon himself the sins of the cosmos. And in his death, he will break the power of sin and death over creation. And he will rise and be given all authority in heaven and on earth. And he will establish the eternal kingdom of God that 2,000 years later is still going strong the world over. And he will build the true house of God, which is made up not of mortar and brick, but of living stones, hearts of human beings who have surrendered themselves to him and become dwelling places of God by his Holy Spirit. God is saying, I've made my plans. I've promised David what I'm going to do, and it's going to happen. And Solomon is not going to be able to stop me from doing what I promised. And Rehoboam is not going to stop me from doing what I promised. I am going to deliver on my promise. Verse 37, and I will take you, and you will reign over all your soul desires, and you will be king over Israel. So he says, you're going to get those 10 tribes, and you're going to have free reign to do whatever you want to do. It's going to be up to you. And here's what God says to him, but let me make you an offer. Let me tell you something I will offer to you. And this is outstanding. We read nowhere else in the Bible that God makes this kind of offer to anybody. He says, and it will happen that if you heed everything I command, and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did, I will be with you and will build to you a stable house as I built for David, and I will give you Israel. God is telling Jeroboam, I can do with your family something as significant as what I'm doing with David's family. The history of Israel could have been the history of two kingdoms shining a bright light in the world. That was the offer God made, to give him a stable, permanent house and to do something significant in the world and to impact the world indelibly through his family. And I will afflict David's offspring because of this, but not forever. That's the offer God makes. And then the wrap up, therefore Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and he stayed in Egypt until Solomon's death. Now, when Rehoboam is king, Shishak will come into the whole region, and he has designs on conquering north, so he's very happy to welcome enemies of King Solomon. He's preparing, and he will come in and impose a crippling tribute on Rehoboam. He'll lose all his money. So that's why Shishak is receiving Jeroboam. He's happy to help enemies of Solomon. So I think it's hard for Jeroboam at this moment to really grasp what God has offered him. Now for us today, we can look back over the completed promises to David. And we can see century upon century of God's faithfulness to the dynasty of David. And even once that dynasty ended, when the Babylonians came in 597 BC and destroyed the temple and took everybody off into exile, and from then on, no descendant of David was on the throne, still God did not abandon his promise to David and brought about Jesus Christ, who has changed everything for the whole cosmos. I don't think David himself had any idea just how big what God was promising to him would be. So maybe Jeroboam can't quite tell the magnitude of what he's being offered here. But surely he can look back and see what God did with David, and how David went from being a nobody shepherd into the most important spiritual leader Israel had had since Moses. And how God had protected him and done such great things, and how God was saying, even if your kids mess up, I'm going to keep this thing going. God is telling Jeroboam, I can do the same with you. Even if you're faithful to me, even if your kids blow it, I will still keep the promise that I'm making to you. He could have established the certainty of his dynasty, even if his kids messed up. But that's not what Jeroboam does. I'm skipping some stuff. We read next the story of Solomon dies. Rehoboam rises to the throne. Israel asks him, cut back on all the forced labor. And Rehoboam says, I'm going to make it even harder for you. And they say, oh, right, yeah, well, then you rule over Judah and we're done with you. And boom, that's it. They say, Jeroboam, would you be our king? Sure, I will. And that's what we've skipped over in a nutshell. Verse 25. And Jeroboam built Shechem on a mountain of Ephraim and dwelt there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. So I think we can see from this, Jeroboam is not real sure where to settle in. First he builds up Shechem, and there's some history there. That's where Israel buried the bones of Joseph when they came back from Egypt. And there are some important events in the history of Israel in Shechem. So maybe this is a good location, but he builds it up, and then apparently he's not happy with that. So he moves on and builds Penuel, and we can sense a sense of instability on Jeroboam's side. Now he grew up serving Solomon in Jerusalem, and he's been around all the monumental architecture there in Jerusalem that Solomon has built. And boy, he doesn't have the money or the resources. He can't ask people to do the kind of work Solomon was asking people to do. That's why they split. He knows what he's accomplishing is nothing like what Rehoboam just got handed to him for free. And Jeroboam thought to himself, now the kingdom might go back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, then the heart of this people might go back to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Now, this is not paranoia. This is a very legitimate concern. He knows I have nothing to offer that looks anything like what they're going to see when they go to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the festivals. And they're going to walk up and ascend the steps onto the Temple Mount, and the whole palace complex is there around it. And they're just going to say, wow, this is what a real king looks like. This is what a real temple looks like. And Jeroboam has nothing that compares to any of that. And he's afraid. They're going there year after year all the time, and he knows that these visuals have an effect on people, and they're going to start saying, this Jeroboam really isn't much. Maybe we should just go back to Rehoboam. It's a legitimate concern. And he finds himself in a situation, the kind of situation David lived his whole life in. A situation where he faces very real danger, and if God doesn't take care of him, he's toast. David lived on that edge his whole life. Now Jeroboam finds himself in that situation. What's he going to do? Verse 28, so the king took counsel and made 2 young bulls of gold and told them, it is too much trouble for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he put the one in Bethel and set up the other in Dan. And this matter became a sin, and the people walked to stand before one of them as far as Dan. Jeroboam asked for advice. We're not told who he asked for this advice, but clearly the advice was not godly. And this is what he decided to do. Okay, I can't afford to build a temple. I can't afford to build a palace that people will be impressed by. What I can do is construct something that Jerusalem doesn't have. So he took gold, perhaps invested the little resources he had in building 2 young bulls out of gold. Now that probably cost him a pretty penny, but it's a lot cheaper than trying to build a temple. So he makes these and tells people, it's too much trouble to go all the way down to the furthest south tribe in Israel and go all the way down to Judah to worship in Jerusalem. Just stop here in Bethel and let's worship here. Or if you're way far north, go all the way north to Dan and worship there, and it'll be great. And what he's doing, nobody in Canaan was worshiping any bull gods. It's not that that the Canaanites worshiped bulls. But what to them the bull represented was the attributes of the God they were worshiping. And the bull became kind of an illustration of the strength and might and power of the God they were worshiping. So what Jeroboam is saying, he's not saying, turn away from Yahweh and worship this other God I've made up. He's saying, let me provide you something Jerusalem won't give you. Let me provide you with a visual to assist you in your worship of Yahweh. Now, the reason in Jerusalem they didn't have that is that God said, don't do this. But he says, it's so hard to worship a God you can't see. I mean, praying to him and lifting up your praises to him and listening to his word and committing it to memory and putting it in your heart and developing this relationship with an invisible God is so hard. But everybody else does it this way. Why don't we do it this way? You just have your visual representation of your God, and it'll focus your devotion and attention so much better. And he's not saying let's abandon Yahweh. He's saying this is Yahweh. Let's worship Yahweh together, and let's do it in a different way. And people love idols. The Christian church has a long, sad history of doing exactly this. And missionaries would go into nations that had not heard the gospel, and they would find pagan cultures that worshiped different gods, and then they would try to find saints in the history of the church that they could kind of correlate to the local deity, and they would try to replace that local pagan god with a saint. And they wouldn't say, this is God. They would say, this saint will do for you what this God did for you, but he's not a God. He's a person just like you. It's just that he really loved God, and we can use him to help you pattern your life after the same kind of faith and devotion that this saint had, and it will be a wonderful thing to help you grow as a Christian in your walk with God. But that's not what it ended up being. What it ended up being was whitewashed necromancy. What it ended up being was this saint becomes the God I used to worship. I've just changed his name, and now I've got an image of this God that I can put on a stand, or I can put in a painting in my house, or I can hang on a locket on my neck, and I can carry this God around with me, and these physical things become objects of power that channel spiritual blessings and help to me. Good luck. And protection and all these kinds of things. And what we have is just bald-faced paganism and superstition instead of a living relationship with God. That's a problem we have to this day, that we don't want to have a relationship with the invisible God. We want something tangible we control, and we want this little lucky charm to do its thing for us because we don't have time for a relationship with God. So Jeroboam is actually very shrewd. What he offers, he knows the people immediately, well, that'll work for us. We love the idea of the bulls and this whole, and it even smacks of history and genuine antiquity and all these things. And there's also, let me show you a map, because there's another reason this was really smart. So this is a map of ancient Israel, and these are the major highways. So if you look there, Jerusalem, you see the Dead Sea. If you go west from the Dead Sea, you'll hit Jerusalem at the top of the Dead Sea. If you follow the road that went on the inside, there was a coastal road that went along the area of the Philistines. But if you go on the internal roads that people would use to go down to Jerusalem, if you follow the road north from Jerusalem, you'll see that Bethel is right there on that same road. So all Jeroboam had to do was set up in Bethel, and when people were coming down to do the festivals in Jerusalem, he would intercept them in Bethel and say, man, I can take several hours off your trip. Why don't you just stay here and worship here? Hey! And for those who lived on the other side of the Jordan and had the difficult process of trying to cross the Jordan, they could just go up north to Dan. Ooh, thank you. How convenient. Yeah, Dan is way up there in the far north. Now, Dan, if you've been to that area, this is kind of looking up, you see the beautiful Mount Hermon up there in the distance. And it's this snow-peaked, great, beautiful mountain. And the snow would melt in the spring, and the waters would just come flowing down. And this was one of the most lush, the vegetation there, all the water that flowed down that would end up in the Sea of Galilee, and then from there flowed down into the Jordan River. All that water would come through there. So this was, if you want to talk about fertility, and things, just an abundance of life. And this was a beautiful place to set up a temple and for people to come and worship. And it was much more convenient for those who lived in the northern territories to go up to Dan and worship there. There's another reason Bethel was an excellent choice. Now, here's what we can say about Jerusalem. It had zero legitimacy as a significant site in the history of Israel. In fact, David conquered the city from the Jebusites. It used to be called the city of Jebus. He conquered the city from the Jebusites, and it's only from David's point forward that it became a Jewish city. And there's no story of any of the patriarchs doing anything in Jebus. There were no encounters with God, no significant, but Bethel. Now, Bethel's got some pretty serious credentials. When God called Abraham out of the land of the Chaldeans, and he traveled all this journey and ended up in Canaan, when he arrived in Canaan, he arrived at Bethel, and there he built an altar and worshiped Yahweh. When Jacob was fleeing for his life, he stopped in Bethel, and he spent the night there. And as he had this vision of a stairway connecting the earth and heaven. And at the top of the stairway, there stood Yahweh in all his glory and splendor. And Yahweh's angels were in a constant flurry of motion up and down that stairway. And it was a visual representation that God is intimately and passionately and constantly involved in everything that's going on here on the earth. When Jacob woke up, he said, "This is the house of God, and I didn't even know it." And he changed the name of the city. It didn't used to be called Bethel. It used to be called Luz. And Jacob changed the name of the city to Bethel, house of God. What a great name for a city to set up a place of worship, right? After Jacob, later in life, returns from Haran, sets up in Shechem and ends up having to leave Shechem, he and his family established themselves in Bethel and lived there. In fact, just 2 generations back, when Samuel, the final judge, was going on a circuit and judging and providing spiritual leadership in 4 cities of Israel, Bethel was one of those cities. So there's 500 reasons to say this is a great place for us to worship Yahweh. There's more he did. Verse 31, and he equipped the high places with a shrine and made priests from among the whole people who were not sons of Levi. And Jeroboam appointed a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that was in Judah. And he offered sacrifices on the altar. Thus he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the young bulls that he had made. And he established priests of the high places that he had made in Bethel. And he offered sacrifices on the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, a month that he had devised all by himself from his own heart. And he made a feast for the children of Israel, and he offered burnt sacrifices on the altar. So what else does he do? And this is really, if you're figuring out how to consolidate power, he's got like the dictator's playbook. He really knows what he's doing here. Another thing that happens is there were all these clandestine places of worship. They're called high places. And basically it's anywhere that there was an elevated area, and if maybe that elevated area happened to have a big tree, something really, people would think, this is a place you're closer to the gods. It's a great place to worship. And little kind of shrines would pop up in these high places. They were not officially sanctioned. They were not anything that the government would establish or build or do anything like that. But they're scattered throughout, and they're really not supposed to be there, because the law of Moses made it very clear. You don't just worship and offer sacrifices wherever you want to. You go to the place God has designated, and all Israel was supposed to go to the temple in Jerusalem to present their sacrifices. But people would offer sacrifices in these high places and do kind of make up their own version of how are we going to worship Yahweh. So what Jeroboam does is he knows people like this stuff. So he actually, literally in the Hebrew, what it says is he built a house in the high places. So he kind of officially embraced the high places as legitimate places of worship, and even did something to signify that this is a legitimate place of worship. He built a house. Now, it probably wasn't a full-blown temple, but something, some kind of a shrine or something that would communicate this is a place where you can legitimately go and worship Yahweh. And he even set up priests to lead these kind of do-it-your-own-way places of worship throughout the territory of Israel. He established priests. Now, he broke with the tribe of Levi. Now, the law of Moses said the tribe of Levi were the ones who were supposed to be priests, and it was their duty to know the law of God and teach people the law of God. And he cuts the Levites out completely. He doesn't want them talking about what Moses said we should do. He wants them making up their own stuff. And he wants priests who are going to be loyal not to the law of Moses, but to him. So he appoints them. And he says, okay, you can be a priest, and you can be a priest, and you can be a priest. And they're running this have it your own way approach to worship all over the place. And there's one more thing. There's a festival going on in Judah, and he wants to compete with it. Now, it's hard to know exactly, because he sets something up on day 15 of the 8th month, and the official, in the law of Moses, the official festival was the 15th day of the 7th month. So it would have been a month earlier that the Feast of Tabernacles took place. And this was the final feast of the year, and they would have finished gathering in all of their crop, and this was a feast thanking God for the crop and for his provision. So that was the point of the Feast of Tabernacles, and they were also remembering how God had fed them and provided for them while they were in the wilderness living in tents. So he makes up something a month after that, and some people speculate maybe it's because in the northern tribes the crops ended up the end of the harvest in the northern territories was a little later than in the southern territories. And maybe he was just giving people a little more time and accommodating a more convenient time for them to finish doing all of their gathering in of their crops before they came to celebrate a feast. But he's basically competing with what's going on in Judah, and he's making it up. There's nothing in the law of Moses giving him any guidelines. He just completely makes this up out of thin air and says, let's just do this. If we had looked at all the details in the stories of Moses and coming out of Israel, God made such a huge issue of the Israelites making up their own versions of worship. God killed a lot of people to make that point. He killed 2 sons of Aaron for doing that. He killed in the rebellion of Dathan and Abiram and On. All of those, God killed a lot of those people who were trying to say, we want to say how worship should happen. And God kept saying, no, it has to be the way I'm setting it up. And Jeroboam is completely breaking all of that. Also, he is mirroring Aaron. You remember when Moses went up on Mount Sinai and he was there 40 days and this fire and burning, and people say, oh, there's no way he survived that. He's toast. He's dead. What do we do now? So let's read in Exodus 32 what Aaron did. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh. Jeroboam's doing exactly what Aaron did. He's making it up on the fly and creating this bull representation of Yahweh to worship. So what do we learn from Jeroboam? You might think you don't have much in common with him. God's not offered you to be a king, or has he? In some way, we're all like Jeroboam, this side of Jesus. What did Jesus do? He came, he defeated sin and death, and extended freely to anyone who will receive it this offer. Trust your life to me. Obey me. Follow after me. And I will make you immortal. And I will make you a participant with me in the governance of everything that exists. You will rule with me. And just like Jeroboam, I don't think we have any idea just how big what Jesus has promised us is going to end up being. We can speculate. We have some vague idea of how glorious and great this might be. But we have the same challenge. The way to receive what God has promised us is to trust our lives to Him. And we can do like Jeroboam and say, no, I'm too scared. There's no way. I can't just depend on God. I've got to take hold of things. I've got to do it my way. It's not going to work. And we can let fear rob us of the eternal glory and significance that God has offered. Or we can do not what Jeroboam did, but what David did. And say, I don't care what life throws at me. I'm just going to hang on to God, come what may. And that is my venture in life. I am throwing all my lot in on this, and this is what I'm going to do. And however it plays out, I'll just leave it up to God. I want to invite you today to follow David's example. Don't be like Jeroboam. Don't let fear keep you from what God's offering. We're going to sing a song now. This is our time to answer back to God. His word is not just information. It is an invitation. God is saying, trust your life to me. Give it all over to me. And let me do something glorious with your life. And your response has to be yes or no. So we incorporate in our worship a time for you to do that, to respond. And if you need to respond, if God is calling you today to trust your life to Him, and you want to respond to Him this morning, come forward. The altar is open. You can kneel here and surrender yourself to Him. If you want to talk to somebody to pray with you and to help you pray, I'm more than happy to help you with that. I'll be over here on the side with my wife. Let's all stand. Please come while we sing.